write some custom CSS. I'm going to change my markup just a tiny bit. Right now, we just have an H1, a form, and then a div. What I want to happen is for the form to be kind of on the left side and the other to be on the right. Now I could do that without changing the markup, but I wanted to get a little trickier than that. So what I did, very small thing, I put everything except the H1 inside a main element. That's a new HTML5 element. It behaves exactly like a div, but it has some semantic meaning. So instead of saying div ID equals main, you can just have a main element, which is just a little nicer. It's cleaner markup, and it takes advantage of the fact that the whole point of markup is to describe the parts of a document. This is the main part of the document. Good, I like that. Then we ruin it by throwing a div inside there. That's okay. So now the form is inside of a div of its own. And, of course, we still have our div for the stats. And I did that because of the way I wanted to write my CSS. So my next commit was to add more style. So first I imported a Google font, and we will talk about that more in the next project. But I imported a web font. We already have this padding 1 rim on here. Now we also have a font family, Open Sans, just a little nicer looking. If it doesn't find Open Sans, if it fails to import it and it's not installed in your machine, it'll fall back to just any old sans serif font. And the H1, we specify this is the level of boldness, the thickness, or the weight, the font weight. Anybody seen the slash thing before? So this is the actual font size here, which happens to be the same as 4 rim, right? This is the line height. More about that in a future project. And then text transform means no matter how we entered the text with mixed case, it's going to change it to all caps. And then I'm going to center it. But then I also made a little change to the markup for the H1. I put a span in there. Anybody know what a span is? Yeah.
I don't know what a span is. I ended up needing to use it instead of a div to put my block, like my color block, inline.
Okay, yeah. That's the key word, inline. So div and span are both semantically meaningless elements. They're just basically containers. The difference is div is a block level element, like a paragraph, something that takes up an entire line. A span is an inline element, something that does not take up its own line. Things like emphasis and strong for bold and italics. You can put those in the middle of a line, right? Or a link, an A. You can put that in the middle of a line. It's not going to create a line break after it automatically. So that's the difference between a span and a div. But they're both kind of meaningless. So I just wrapped that around person. And then in my CSS, I specified that a span inside an H1 should not be so bold, should be a little smaller, and should use a totally different font, and should be italicized, and should be all lowercase, and should have a little bit of margin. Like this. It's kind of what it sounds like. So if this thing is here now, and I put some negative top margin, it's going to move up. And then I do some stuff that we're not going to get real deep into just yet. Flexbox is a new way of doing layout in the last few years. Browser support is way better than it used to be. It's still, there's still a lot of browsers in use that don't support Flexbox very well. There are some things you can do to get around that. I'm not worrying about it right now. This is just a class project. So I just say that inside my main element, I want to use Flexbox. And then this thing. You've seen this selector before? So we know that this means a div that is inside the main element. That's a descendant selector. The greater than sign is a child selector. And what that means is, say if I said main space form, that would match this, because it's a form that is a descendant of main. If I said main greater than form, it would not match, because that specifically just looks at direct children. So I could use a child selector with the div. I could not use the child selector with the form. It has to be the next level down in the hierarchy if you use this selector. And sometimes that's what you want.
How do you know if something is or isn't in the hierarchy? Like, how would we know that? Like,
Well,
intuitively, I would think that P would be the next thing.
well, so main, div, form, P. So what is P's parent?
I would think form.
Yes. Main is an ancestor, but not its parent. So if it's an ancestor, you need to use space. That's a descendant selector. But if that thing is the direct parent, you could use this. Now, that means that space will match parent-child relationships too, right? Because children are descendants. The reason I did this is because what about the color div? I just want this rule to apply to this div that contains the form and stats itself. But I know that way deep within stats, I'm going to have these color divs, and they're divs too. And I don't want this rule to apply to that. So I say only divs that are direct children of main should have this, whatever this does. And we won't get into that. So then I do some other stuff that styles the list. I use a couple other fancy selectors. I do this to get rid of the bullet. Again, that's child selector. Oh man, what about this? What the heck is that plus? Plus is an adjacent sibling selector. What that means is, and you can guess what sibling means, right? These two paragraphs are siblings of each other, right? So if I had a selector P plus P, that would mean a paragraph that is an adjacent sibling of another paragraph. In other words, it immediately follows another paragraph. So that would totally match this paragraph, right? It immediately follows another one. But it would not match the first one. This paragraph is not the next sibling of another paragraph. So this would not match. This isn't primarily a CSS bootcamp, of course. So if this is just, confusing you, then feel free to ignore this. But if you want to learn, I'm talking through it a little. So the effect here is I want there to be some space between all the LIs. So I put some top margin on them, but I don't want the very first one to start one rim down. I want it to start at the very top. So they all have top margin except for the very first one. And there are a couple of different ways I could have done that, but this is how I wanted to do it. And then I just style the DT and the DD and stuff to get them to look a little something like this. All right, so now these are all nicely aligned on the right. These are nicely aligned on the left. I will talk real quick about this last thing. Nth-of-type. So this colon represents a pseudo class. Classes, you use a dot. But there are some pseudo classes that are automatically applied to an element that matches certain criteria. The most common one you see is hover. So you might see this. So a regular old A on the page will not have this pseudo class until the moment you move your mouse over it. And then this pseudo class is applied automatically. And if there were a rule for that, that rule would suddenly apply. Nth-of-type is an even more special one because it takes an argument, but you can guess what this actually does, right? The even DLs have a different background color. White smoke instead of white. So if I add another one of these, you can see every other one has a different background color. So that's some fanciness, but now you've seen it, and if you want to look up more about it and use it yourself, you can. And that is pretty much person stats.